Edward Harrington grew up in a red brick terrace on the edge of Sheffield, where the wind tasted faintly of iron and rain and the grocery list was a strategy more than a certainty. His father, Thomas, came home with oil on his knuckles and a weary smile that pretended not to be a wince. His mother, Elaine, worked double shifts on the respiratory ward and kept a jar of coins behind the oatmeal for emergencies that arrived like clockwork. Edward learned early to fix what could be fixed: leaky taps, rattling bike chains, a neighbor's lawnmower that refused to spark, and to outthink what couldn't. He rode a second-hand bicycle to school before dawn, delivering newspapers along a route he knew by chimney and scent, and wound down at night with chess problems scribbled in the margins of old notebooks. When the house slept, he climbed to the roof and watched planes stitch pale threads across the sky, promising routes he couldn't yet afford to follow. He did not know it, but there were pages in his story written in an older hand, a surname he wore without context, a silence around his father's side of the family that felt like a locked room he had been warned not to open. Across the country in the book-lined quiet of Cambridge, Clara Montgomery grew up in a townhouse whose cracked crown molding suggested a past more glamorous than its present. Her parents, Robert and Elizabeth, were dignified in the way people are when they have almost, but not quite, kept hold of better days. The house smelled of old paper and lemon polish, and Clara's favorite place was the narrow staircase where sunlight sliced in like a bookmark. She loved the order of timetables, the comfort of routines, the arc of a well-told story. More than anything, she dreamed of teaching literature, of making sense of life by showing others how words arranged themselves into truth. Money was a fog they all learned to walk through without commenting on the damp. Clara tutored younger students in the evenings and jogged along the Cam at dawn, reciting memorized lines to keep pace. Her struggle was subtler than hardship that howls. It was the steady pressure of expectation, the fear of becoming one more bright person who never quite reached the light. She promised herself, quietly and often, that stability was not a luxury but a destination she would reach without losing her kindness on the way. If Edward and Clara belonged to different maps, fate began folding those maps toward each other long before they noticed. On a rain-glossed October afternoon, Edward took a detour after an open-day talk at King's College, following a crowd into a public lecture about narrative ethics, free seats, free warmth, and the hope of learning how people worked. Clara, early as always, had claimed an aisle seat near the back and balanced a notebook on her knee, ready to test the lecturer's conclusions against the novels she'd loved in secret since childhood. The room filled with the hush of collective attention, and their lives edged closer with each sentence that caught them both at the same angle. Edward listened for the moving parts of people, Clara listened for the honesty beneath performance. When a microphone failed and the room fidgeted, Edward stood, traced the cable like a puzzle, and coaxed sound back to life. Applause scattered. Clara's eyes found his, surprised by the simple grace of competence. Neither spoke to the other that day. But walking out into the thin mist, both felt, without words, the sensation of stepping onto a bridge they had not planned to cross, as if somewhere a locked room had clicked, softly, toward open. Clara Montgomery's childhood was defined by contrasts, the grandeur of family name and heritage versus the realities of dwindling wealth. Her father, Robert Montgomery, had once been a promising historian whose works were praised in academic circles but never translated into financial security. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who had once stood in grand lecture halls, though now he taught in modest community programs. Her mother, Elizabeth, was practical, holding the family together with careful budgeting and relentless optimism. Clara grew up in the middle of these two currents, her father's world of ideas and her mother's world of necessity. Even as the plaster peeled in their townhouse and the fine silverware was gradually sold to keep bills paid, Clara developed a resilience that kept her rooted. She loved to sit by her father as he recited passages of Shakespeare, his voice carrying the authority of a man who believed words could alter destinies, even if they hadn't altered his own. School became both a sanctuary and a battlefield for Clara. Her natural intelligence made her stand out, but her family's declining financial status made her a target of whispers among peers from wealthier backgrounds. She buried herself in literature, finding solace in the voices of Austen, Bronte, and Eliot. The heroines she admired were not simply characters but guides, showing her how dignity could survive even in the shadow of hardship. Clara dreamed of teaching others to find the same strength in words, and that dream propelled her through long nights of study under dim lamps and dawn jogs to clear her thoughts. She became a tutor for struggling classmates, not just to earn extra money but to prove to herself that she could turn her passion into purpose. Each student's success was her small rebellion against the idea that her background would define her limits. Despite her quiet, reflective nature, Clara was not without ambition. She envisioned a future where she could step into a classroom of her own, a place where stories were not only taught but lived, where she could be the bridge between books and the lives they touched. Yet beneath her calm determination lay a constant, unspoken fear that her dreams would remain just beyond her reach, the way so many of her parents' dreams had. Her cousin Margaret often reminded her of these fears, making cutting remarks about how people like them had to settle. Clara, however, had resolved not to settle. In her, the past's dignity and the present's hardship fused into a determination that her future would not be dictated by compromise. Though she could not yet see how her path would cross Edward Harrington's, every choice she made, every moment of perseverance, was carrying her closer to the bridge that would eventually unite their worlds. Edward Harrington's story began in a small, cluttered house where the smell of engine grease clung to everything and ambition felt like an uninvited guest. His father, Thomas, spent his life repairing cars in a tiny garage at the edge of town, while his mother, Elaine, nursed patients in overcrowded wards where every day demanded sacrifice. Edward was their only child, and though his parents never said it aloud, he carried the weight of their unspoken hopes. He spent his evenings tinkering with broken radios, fixing bicycles for neighbors, and saving scraps of metal in a box he called his future machine. For him, every mechanical puzzle was more than a challenge. It was proof that even when life broke, it could be fixed with enough patience and cleverness. Yet Edward wasn't satisfied with small victories. He had an appetite for the bigger world, one he glimpsed in magazines he borrowed from the library, and glossy photos of skyscrapers and men in suits who spoke confidently about markets and empires. He wanted not only to repair but to build, not only to survive but to rise. His hobbies, chess, problem-solving, and late-night reading of business case studies, were all pieces of a larger hunger to craft a life so far removed from his beginnings that no one could ever reduce him to the mechanic's son. Still, his path was not without obstacles. Edward's family could barely afford his education, and every semester at university was a battle fought with part-time jobs and scholarships won through relentless effort. He delivered newspapers at dawn, worked in warehouses at night, and still managed to maintain grades that made his professors take notice. Yet financial struggle wasn't the only challenge he faced. The world he entered at university was one of privilege and entitlement, where students arrived in luxury cars and treated overseas trips as casual getaways. Edward, with his patched jacket and cautious spending, was an outsider. It was during this time he met James Oliver, a fellow student whose wealth was evident in every polished detail of his life. James, however, admired Edward's sharp mind and grounded determination, and though their friendship was unlikely, it became an important anchor. Edward learned much from James, not only about finance and business but about the subtle codes of a world where confidence and connections often mattered more than raw talent. For Edward, their friendship was a reminder that one could step into circles far removed from one's origins, though it also stoked a private insecurity that he might never truly belong. Despite his insecurities, Edward's determination burned hotter with each challenge. He had dreams of running companies, of leading boardrooms, of proving to himself and the world that a boy from a mechanic's household could build an empire of his own. He filled notebooks with sketches of ideas, notes on lectures, and plans for businesses that might never leave the page but nonetheless kept him reaching forward. At night, when exhaustion clawed at him, he found himself staring out of his dorm window at the city skyline, imagining his name etched in glass above the tallest tower. Yet Edward's greatest struggle wasn't money or opportunity, it was doubt. He carried within him a fear that even if he achieved success, he would always be seen as an imposter in the glittering halls of power. This tension between hunger and fear became the engine of his life. It was in this crucible of ambition and insecurity that Edward's path prepared him for the unexpected future awaiting him, the one tied not only to his dreams but also to a family name he barely understood and a fortune he never believed would come to him. He did not yet know that the empire he longed to build was already waiting, hidden within bloodlines he thought had forgotten him. It was on a brisk autumn morning that Edward and Clara's worlds finally collided, though neither could have predicted how significant that day would become. The university library was unusually crowded, students cramming for exams and filling every corner with the hushed chaos of turning pages and whispered study groups. Clara, ever punctual, had arrived early to secure her favorite seat near the tall arched windows where sunlight spilled in like liquid gold. She had been reviewing a stack of essays she was helping younger students with, her pen moving briskly, her mind alive with the rhythm of sentences. Edward, exhausted from a long shift at his warehouse job the night before, stumbled in slightly late, his hair damp from the drizzle outside, his eyes alert but tired. He wasn't supposed to be there. His original plan had been to meet James for a lecture on market structures. But James had persuaded him to attend a philosophy debate instead, insisting it would expand his perspective. Edward, with his usual curiosity about people, agreed. As fate would have it, the debate was being hosted in the very same hall adjoining the library where Clara had stationed herself. The paths of two lives shaped by ambition, resilience, and contrasting upbringings were quietly threading themselves together. The debate turned chaotic midway when the microphone system failed, crackling with static before cutting off completely. Murmurs swept through the audience, irritation building as the guest speaker tried to push forward without amplification. Edward, seated in the back, watched the flustered technician struggle and felt the familiar itch of a problem begging to be solved. With quiet confidence, he rose from his seat, excused himself past rows of students, and crouched beside the tangled cables. In a matter of minutes, his hands worked with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime fixing broken things. He located the faulty connection, adjusted it, and coaxed the system back to life. The microphone buzzed, then cleared, the speaker's voice suddenly booming across the hall. The room erupted in applause, students impressed not only by his initiative but by the way he handled the situation without hesitation or arrogance. Among the clapping hands, Clara's gaze locked on him. She had been silently observing, intrigued by the quiet determination in his face, the way he seemed more focused on solving the problem than on gaining recognition. To her, he didn't look like the typical university student who thrived on appearances. He looked like someone grounded, someone with substance. Though the lecture carried on, the moment lingered between them like an unfinished sentence. When it ended, Clara lingered in the hall, packing her books slowly, stealing glances at Edward as he joked quietly with James. She debated whether to approach him, curiosity tugging at her heart, but her natural reserve held her back. Edward, for his part, felt the prickling awareness of eyes on him but dismissed it as nothing more than the usual attention after a public display. As they left through the same door, a sudden drizzle quickened into rain, scattering students under umbrellas. Clara dropped a paper from her folder, and Edward, walking just behind, bent down to pick it up. Their eyes met properly for the first time, hers a shade of quiet intelligence and unspoken strength, his carrying a tired determination and warmth that belied his rough edges. He handed the paper back with a small smile, murmuring, "You nearly lost your thesis there." Clara chuckled softly, replying, "It's only an essay draft, but thank you." Neither said more, yet both walked away with the odd, unexplainable certainty that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. It was as though the world, in its own cryptic language, had whispered that something new had begun. Over the following weeks, Edward and Clara found themselves drifting into each other's orbit with a frequency that felt almost orchestrated. The campus was vast, yet their paths seemed to cross with uncanny regularity, whether in the bustling cafe near the economics department, during late-night study sessions in the library, or along the tree-lined walkways where autumn leaves carpeted the ground. At first, their conversations were polite and brief, discussions about lectures, books they were reading, or the exhaustion of balancing part-time work and study. But gradually, those exchanges lengthened into moments neither wanted to end. Edward, usually guarded about his working-class struggles, found himself sharing snippets about his family, about his father's long hours in the garage and his mother's unwavering strength. Clara, equally cautious with strangers, admitted her fears about becoming irrelevant, her yearning to find a purpose that went beyond surviving her family's fading status. These conversations planted the seeds of intimacy, for both recognized in the other a mirror of determination mixed with vulnerability. They were different in background, yet alike in spirit. The bond, once delicate, began to take root in soil richer than either of them had expected. Their relationship deepened with small, carefully chosen moments rather than grand gestures. Edward would walk Clara home after evening tutorials, not minding the long detour even on nights when rain soaked his shoes. Clara, in turn, would pack extra food during her lunch breaks, slipping sandwiches or cookies into Edward's hands when she knew he'd skip meals to save money. They studied together often, Clara explaining nuances of literature while Edward shared insights into problem-solving from his business courses. Those evenings in dimly lit study halls, with textbooks spread like landscapes between them, became the foundation of their affection. Friends began to notice the quiet rhythm between the two, how Edward's gaze unconsciously sought Clara's when he spoke, how Clara's laughter softened when he was near. Even James Oliver, usually quick with teasing remarks, recognized something deeper brewing and refrained from mocking Edward's growing attachment. Yet with affection came challenges. Edward feared that Clara might one day see him as inadequate, someone unworthy of her grace and intellect, while Clara wrestled with the worry that her cousin Margaret's sneering predictions, that she would tether herself to someone with no real future, might one day become true. Still, love has a way of pressing past doubt when hearts are sincere. Their first true outing beyond campus was a spontaneous trip to the city's Riverside Fair. Edward, uncomfortable at first amid flashing lights and expensive rides, found himself at ease when Clara tugged him toward a simple stall where they shared roasted chestnuts and laughed at fortune-tellers shouting predictions. It was there, under strings of lanterns swaying in the wind, that Edward reached for Clara's hand without overthinking, and she didn't pull away. That night, walking her back, silence carried their emotions more loudly than words. Edward's chest was tight with a new kind of nervousness, one that came not from fear of failure but from the realization of how much she now meant to him. Clara, gazing at the reflection of city lights in the river, whispered quietly, "Sometimes, I feel as though meeting you was the world's way of giving me back something I thought I'd lost." Edward, unsure how to respond, only tightened his hold on her hand. Neither realized it yet, but their love was becoming the anchor that would later be tested against storms fiercer than either of them could yet imagine. Edward had never been the type of man to dream about romance in grand, cinematic gestures, but when it came to Clara, he found himself wanting to do things differently. The thought of proposing to her began to occupy his mind in ways that startled him, while in lectures, while working late in the warehouse, even in moments when he should have been focused on solving financial problems. He would catch himself sketching ring designs in the margins of his notebooks, only to laugh at how absurd it felt for a man living paycheck to dream of something so extravagant. Yet his resolve hardened. Clara deserved more than the bare minimum, and if she was to share her life with him, then he would give her a memory she could treasure forever. The challenge was money. He knew he couldn't afford the type of ring she truly deserved, and this became a constant thorn in his mind. Edward worked overtime shifts, skipped meals, and took odd jobs on weekends, his body growing tired but his spirit burning with determination. In those long hours, he thought about his father's withered hands, his mother's sacrifices, and the quiet lessons they had instilled in him, that love wasn't about wealth, but effort. That truth guided him, even when doubt whispered that Clara's world and his were too far apart to truly align. Clara, meanwhile, sensed the shift in Edward, though he tried to mask it. His absences grew more frequent, his eyes often weary, but she never questioned his love. Instead, she chose to trust him, remembering all the times he had been present for her in the smallest, most meaningful ways. Still, whispers of skepticism began to seep into her life through her cousin Margaret, who had always disapproved of Edward. Margaret believed Edward's background was a chain that would eventually drag Clara down, and she never failed to remind her of it. "A man like him will never truly belong in your world," Margaret sneered one evening, her tone dripping with disdain. Clara, though hurt by the constant remarks, defended Edward fiercely. She explained that love wasn't about appearances or wealth, it was about trust, respect, and shared dreams. Yet Margaret's words left their sting, not because Clara believed them, but because she feared Edward might one day believe them himself. The tension between their blossoming love and the skepticism surrounding it grew, casting an undercurrent of suspense over their otherwise joyful days. When Edward finally proposed, it wasn't in a lavish ballroom or a candlelit restaurant, but beneath the old oak tree near the university grounds where they often studied together. The sky was painted in shades of violet and gold, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers. Edward, his hands trembling, pulled out a small box containing a simple silver ring with a modest stone, far from extravagant, but chosen with painstaking care. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Clara, I may not have riches, and I may not have a name that means anything in the world right now, but I have a heart that beats only for you. Will you marry me?" Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, not because the ring was humble, but because of the sincerity that radiated from him. She whispered yes before he could even finish, her arms wrapping around him tightly. In that embrace, both knew that their promises were not just to each other, but to the future they would build, brick by brick, no matter how difficult the road might be. Unbeknownst to them, however, Margaret watched from a distance, her lips curling into a faint smile that was anything but warm. She had no intention of letting their story unfold smoothly, and her quiet plotting would later become one of the greatest tests of their love. The wedding of Edward and Clara was not a grand affair by the standards of wealthier families, but for them it was nothing short of magical. They chose a quaint countryside chapel with stained glass windows that glowed like jewels when the sun streamed through. Clara walked down the aisle in a gown her mother had carefully altered from Elizabeth's own wedding dress, the seam stitched with memories and hope. Edward stood at the altar in a suit he had borrowed from James Oliver, his best friend, who insisted that he look the part of a groom, even if Edward would have been content with something simpler. Friends from the university filled the pews, their faces alight with joy, while family members from both sides brought with them an undercurrent of tension. Edward's relatives, humble and hard-working, looked out of place among the Montgomerys, who, though no longer wealthy, carried themselves with an air of refinement. The contrast was stark, and whispers drifted across the chapel like smoke. Still, when Clara and Edward exchanged vows, his voice steady, hers trembling with emotion, the moment silenced every critic. Their promises bound them in a way that words alone could not capture, two souls from different worlds pledging to walk together into an uncertain but shared future. Yet beneath the beauty of the ceremony, conflict simmered. Margaret Montgomery, Clara's sharp-tongued cousin, made her disapproval known with icy stares and pointed comments whenever she could steal the chance. She whispered loudly to an aunt that Clara had thrown herself away on a man with no real future, her bitterness evident even amid the celebration. On Edward's side, his Uncle George, a grizzled mechanic who had raised him like a second father, bristled at Margaret's arrogance, muttering to anyone who would listen that Edward's worth was not measured by his bank account. James, sensing trouble, tried to keep the peace by distracting guests with stories and humor, but the divide between the families was undeniable. Clara's parents, Robert and Elizabeth, attempted to bridge the gap, offering warmth to Edward's kin and insisting that love mattered more than money or status. Their efforts kept the day from unraveling, but the tension lingered like a shadow. For Edward and Clara, however, the noise of judgment faded into irrelevance when they looked into each other's eyes. Their love was enough to drown out the world, for now. The reception, held in a modest garden decorated with fairy lights, was a mixture of joy and unease. Edward and Clara danced their first dance beneath the glow of lanterns, laughter spilling freely as friends clapped and cheered. Yet while the young couple basked in their happiness, storms brewed quietly around them. Margaret cornered Clara in a secluded part of the garden, warning her that marriage to Edward would only end in regret, planting seeds of doubt she hoped would grow. Meanwhile, Edward overheard murmurs among Clara's extended relatives about his lack of pedigree, each word stoking the insecurities he had long buried. Even James, supportive as he was, couldn't shake a pang of envy as he watched the couple, wondering why happiness seemed to come so easily to Edward despite his struggles. Still, the night ended with Edward and Clara stealing away to their small apartment, the echo of their vows still burning in their hearts. They were determined to prove the world wrong, to show that love was enough to wither disdain. What they could not yet see was how life would soon test that conviction, in ways neither family nor friends could have predicted. What started as a modest wedding would become the prologue to a story of power, betrayal, and choices that would one day shake empires. Married life for Edward and Clara began in a modest one-bedroom apartment tucked above a bakery on the quieter side of town. The scent of fresh bread often drifted through their windows at dawn, mingling with the chatter of early risers and the occasional clatter of delivery trucks. It was not glamorous, and the peeling paint on the walls was a reminder of their financial limits, but for Edward and Clara, it was theirs, a space to grow, to dream, and to learn the rhythms of each other's daily lives. Clara decorated the small living room with second-hand curtains and stacks of books, creating warmth where money could not. Edward, determined to provide more, spent hours scribbling calculations at their tiny kitchen table, juggling bills and income from his multiple jobs. Nights were often spent with Clara brewing tea as Edward leaned his weary head against her shoulder, whispering promises of a future he believed they could build together. It was in those quiet hours that their love seemed strongest, forged not by luxury but by sacrifice and shared resilience. Still, the difficulties of their new life pressed heavily on them. Edward's long hours at the warehouse and tutoring sessions left him physically drained, and Clara worried that his determination to shoulder all responsibility would one day break him. Clara herself began teaching literature at a local community center, earning little money but finding deep fulfillment in shaping young minds. Her students adored her, drawn to the way she spoke of novels as though they were living, breathing worlds to be explored. Yet, while she poured herself into her work, Clara was not blind to the sacrifices Edward made. His shoes wore thin from endless hours on his feet, and she often woke at night to find him still awake, staring at the ceiling with worry carved into his features. Despite her reassurances that love was enough, Edward could not silence the voice in his head telling him he needed to do more. That pressure, silent but relentless, began weaving threads of tension between them. Their arguments were never explosive, just quiet exchanges of frustration, both trying to protect the other but failing to find the right balance. Despite these struggles, their small apartment became a place of laughter and tenderness as well. Friends often visited, James with his stories of extravagant nights Edward could not afford, and Anna Thompson, Clara's dearest friend, with her cheerful encouragement that reminded Clara of life's brighter sides. Anna was quick to notice Edward's exhaustion and often teased him about being too proud to ask for help, though she always said it with affection. The couple found solace in simple joys, sharing takeout dinners when they couldn't afford groceries, dancing clumsily to the radio in their living room, and watching the city lights flicker through the window at night. Though their lives were far from easy, these moments stitched them closer together. To Edward, the apartment represented the first step of independence, proof that he was carving a life with the woman he loved. To Clara, it was evidence that love could create home anywhere, no matter how small. Neither of them knew that their fragile balance would soon be disrupted by forces far beyond peeling paint and unpaid bills. That destiny was already preparing to alter the course of their lives with the arrival of news neither had expected. It was on an ordinary Thursday morning, one that began with the familiar aroma of bread wafting up from the bakery downstairs, that Edward received the letter which would unravel the life he and Clara had carefully stitched together. He had been preparing for another grueling day at the warehouse, adjusting his tie with the precision of a man who wanted to appear stronger than he felt, when the postman delivered an envelope thicker and heavier than usual. The Harrington family crest, embossed in gold, caught Edward's eye immediately. He froze, uncertain if he should open it, for the name Harrington was one that had lingered in whispers throughout his childhood, a name his father avoided and his mother never dared explain. Clara, noticing his unease, urged him to open it, her gentle hand resting on his arm. Inside, the words were staggering. Sir William Harrington, his estranged uncle, had passed away, leaving the entirety of his vast empire, industries, estates, fortunes, under Edward's name. For a long moment, Edward simply sat at the table, staring at the letter as though it were a cruel joke. Clara read it over his shoulder, her own breath catching, torn between awe and dread. The life they had always dreamed of improving was about to change overnight, but whether for better or worse, neither could yet tell. In the days that followed, Edward was drawn into a whirlwind of legal proceedings and introductions to a world he had never been prepared for. Charles Whitmore, the Harrington family lawyer, arrived at their apartment with a stack of documents and a demeanor of rigid formality, explaining that Edward had not only inherited wealth but responsibility. Businesses across Europe, vast estates, employees numbering in the thousands. Clara watched as Edward's face shifted from disbelief to reluctant acceptance, the weight of it all pressing visibly onto his shoulders. Margaret, ever quick to insert herself, visited with feigned sympathy, but her sharp glances revealed something closer to envy. She reminded Clara that life among the wealthy was not for small-town girls, her words deliberately laced with poison. Edward, though shaken, clung to Clara's presence as an anchor amid the chaos. Yet, as he attended meeting after meeting with corporate advisors and business strategists, she could already feel a space forming between them. An invisible wall built by responsibilities she could not yet comprehend. The man who once struggled to pay rent now stood at the threshold of unimaginable power, and Clara's heart wrestled with both pride for him and fear of losing the simplicity that had once defined their love. The public revelation of Edward's inheritance soon became front-page news. Reporters camped outside their modest apartment, flashing cameras whenever Edward or Clara dared step outside. Friends like James congratulated him heartily, though even he could not mask a flicker of envy at how fortune had favored Edward so suddenly. Anna, in contrast, worried for Clara, sensing how quickly such wealth could erode even the strongest of bonds. Clara herself tried to remain steady, reminding Edward that they would navigate this new world together, but the unease in her chest grew stronger each day. She saw how the Empire called to him, not just as a burden but as a temptation, a chance to prove to the world that he was more than a mechanic's son. It thrilled her to see him stepping into confidence, yet it terrified her to think of what it might cost them. Late at night, when Edward returned home exhausted from meetings, Clara would trace his hand with hers, whispering that love must remain their foundation. He would nod, kiss her forehead, and promise that nothing would ever change between them. Still, deep within both their hearts, they sensed the truth: everything had already changed, and the future that awaited them was no longer one they could predict. Moving into the Harrington mansion was like stepping into another universe, one where every corner whispered history and power. The sprawling estate, with its marble pillars, grand staircases, and crystal chandeliers, overwhelmed Edward and Clara the moment they arrived. Edward, though visibly astonished, tried to mask his awe, determined to project confidence in front of the staff who now bowed their heads in acknowledgement of him as the new master of the house. Clara, however, found herself shrinking under the weight of it all. The mansion felt cold despite its beauty, its vastness a reminder of how far removed they were from the warmth of their tiny apartment above the bakery. Rooms stretched endlessly, each one furnished with pieces worth more than their entire past life, yet none of it felt like home. Servants lined up to greet them, chefs, maids, gardeners, drivers, each awaiting Edward's command. Clara smiled politely but felt a pang of discomfort. These people, strangers to her, already looked at Edward with a mixture of reverence and expectation, as though she were merely an accessory to his newfound role. She clutched Edward's hand tightly, though in her heart she wondered if she might soon be lost in a world where love could easily be overshadowed by power. Edward, meanwhile, was thrust almost immediately into the complexities of managing the Harrington Empire. Charles Whitmore, the sharp-eyed family lawyer, introduced him to board members who had once taken their orders from his late uncle. Some were skeptical of Edward, viewing him as an unpolished outsider, while others sought to manipulate his inexperience for their own gain. At his side during these meetings was Victoria Hale, a business consultant recommended by Whitmore. Victoria was striking, sharp suits, sharper wit, and an ambition that radiated in every word she spoke. She quickly became indispensable, explaining contracts and strategies in ways Edward could grasp, but her constant presence unsettled Clara. Victoria's piercing glances lingered a little too long, her smile always just a shade too personal. Edward, overwhelmed by the rapid shift in his life, clung to her guidance without realizing the subtle boundaries being blurred. Clara noticed, but she said nothing, choosing instead to focus on supporting her husband silently. Still, she could not ignore the creeping dread that the world Edward had stepped into was not only reshaping him but also erecting walls between them that she couldn't yet scale. The press coverage of Edward's transition into wealth was relentless. Newspapers printed headlines about the unknown heir and the mechanic's son turned empire master, crafting narratives that made Edward a symbol of modern-day fortune. Paparazzi followed them whenever they stepped outside, capturing images of Clara in designer dresses she never felt comfortable wearing, her face scrutinized by critics who deemed her unfit for the role of a billionaire's wife. James Oliver tried to ease the tension, whisking them away to private clubs and reminding Edward to enjoy the perks of wealth, though even he seemed dazzled by the sudden power at Edward's disposal. Anna, on the other hand, warned Clara to hold tightly to her values, sensing how quickly their love could be drowned in excess. Clara, though gracious in public, often cried in private, her heart aching for the simplicity of their apartment, for the days when Edward would collapse into her arms after a long shift and whisper that love was enough. Now, she saw him rehearsing speeches for boardrooms, his eyes glinting with determination but lacking the tenderness she once knew. As Clara stood in the endless halls of the Harrington mansion, her reflection staring back at her in gilded mirrors, she realized the greatest challenge was not adjusting to wealth itself. It was holding on to the man she had married, even as the empire sought to remake him into someone entirely new. Edward's rapid transformation from an ordinary man into the master of a global empire did not go unnoticed, and with that transformation came a dangerous tide of temptations. Lavish parties hosted in his honor became the new normal, filled with flashing cameras, clinking glasses, and the perfume of strangers who smiled too widely, eager to gain his favor. At first, Edward was uncomfortable in such settings, his humble background making him feel out of place amid glittering gowns and designer suits. Yet as weeks turned into months, he began to adapt, his confidence growing with every introduction to politicians, magnates, and socialites who treated him like a king. Clara, by his side at these events, felt the growing distance between them. While she clung to this shared history, Edward seemed intoxicated by the newfound respect he received from those who had once sneered at him. She could see how he thrived on the applause, the admiration, and the constant reinforcement that he now belonged to a higher echelon of society. For Clara, however, the admiration directed at Edward only intensified her own sense of invisibility, a shadow at the edge of his ever-brightening spotlight. Victoria Hale, Edward's ambitious business consultant, played a pivotal role in this shift. Her guidance in boardrooms was sharp, precise, and indispensable, but her presence extended far beyond business hours. She began accompanying Edward to gala dinners and networking events, often leaning close to whisper advice that sounded more like seduction than strategy. Edward, blinded by gratitude and flattered by the attention, failed to notice the subtle games Victoria was playing. Clara noticed, however, and the sight of Victoria's hand lingering on Edward's arm, or the way she smiled at him with a possessive gleam in her eyes, stoked a quiet storm inside her heart. Margaret, ever eager to stir trouble, seized the opportunity to remind Clara that her husband was slipping away. "Did you really think a man in his position would stay tied to the girl from a crumbling townhouse?" she sneered one evening, her words slicing deeper than she could know. Clara remained outwardly composed, but in private she wrestled with fears that the man she had built a life with was slowly being consumed by the empire's demands and the people circling him like predators. The board members added to Edward's temptations, subtly feeding his ego. Some suggested that his marriage to Clara weakened his image, hinting that a wife of more prestigious lineage would strengthen the empire's legacy. Edward dismissed the comments outwardly, but inside, the seeds of doubt were being sown. He began to wonder, though guiltily, whether Clara truly fit into this new world. Clara, meanwhile, tried to anchor herself by throwing her energy into charity work, hoping to preserve her identity and worth outside the glitz of Edward's life. Yet the more she gave to others, the more she realized she was losing Edward, not to another woman just yet, but to the intoxicating allure of power itself. The tension between them simmered quietly, masked by polite smiles and public appearances, but both could feel the cracks beginning to spread. What had once been a love forged in simplicity was now at risk of being fractured by excess, by ambition, and by the whispers of those who wished to see them undone. Neither of them knew it yet, but the true test of their marriage was no longer financial struggle, it was whether love could survive in the shadow of temptation and power. The Harrington mansion, with all its grandeur and endless rooms, became Clara's prison of silence. What once had been her dream of stability now felt like a gilded cage, one where her laughter echoed back at her without anyone to share it. Edward, consumed by board meetings, late-night negotiations, and endless dinners with investors, spent less and less time with her. When he did return, his presence was distracted, his mind still in the boardroom, his phone buzzing incessantly with messages from Victoria or Charles Whitmore. Clara would sit at the long dining table, dinners gone cold, waiting for a conversation that never came. She had thought wealth might make life easier, but instead, it magnified her isolation. The mansion staff, though polite, were strangers performing duties, not companions. Clara's days grew empty, her once vibrant laughter replaced with quiet sighs as she filled her hours reading novels, journaling her thoughts, and walking through gardens too perfect to feel real. The more Edward drifted into his empire, the more Clara felt herself disappearing into the shadows of his success. Desperate for meaning, Clara turned to the world outside the mansion. She began visiting local charities, places where hunger and need stripped life down to its rawest truths. At first, she went quietly, unsure if her presence would be welcomed, but soon she found herself immersed in helping children learn to read and organizing small fundraising efforts. It was in this world of need, rather than luxury, that Clara began to feel alive again. During one of these visits, she met Dr. Daniel Carter, a charismatic physician who devoted his life to offering medical care to the poor. Daniel was warm, approachable, and genuinely passionate about his work. Unlike the wealthy socialites surrounding Edward, Daniel treated Clara as though she were not just the billionaire's wife, but a woman with her own voice and value. His encouragement rekindled something within her, a reminder of the woman she had been before the mansion, before the cameras, before Edward's empire had begun to suffocate her. Clara found solace in their conversations, drawn to the sincerity in Daniel's words and the way he spoke of dreams rooted not in power, but in compassion. Yet, even as she carved out a purpose for herself, Clara could not ignore the growing emptiness between her and Edward. At night, when he returned from his high-rise meetings, smelling of cigars and expensive cologne, Clara would ask about his day, only to receive distracted replies. His eyes, once so present and warm, now carried a faraway gleam that unsettled her. Clara longed to tell him of the children she taught, of the joy she felt making a difference, but he hardly listened, dismissing her stories as though they were trivial compared to the empire's affairs. She realized with dread that her husband was slipping away, not into the arms of another woman just yet, but into the clutches of ambition and the flattery of people like Victoria. Clara stood at a painful crossroads, fighting to remain the anchor in Edward's storm of success, yet realizing she was increasingly adrift in her own solitude. The irony was bitter. The more wealth they had, the poorer their marriage became. And as Clara closed her journal one evening with trembling hands, she whispered a truth that chilled her. Perhaps the empire had not been an inheritance at all, but a curse disguised in gold. Edward Harrington had always believed himself anchored by Clara's love, yet in the whirlwind of meetings, power, and the endless demands of empire, small doubts began to creep in, doubts whispered by others, amplified by his own insecurities. Margaret, never missing an opportunity to stir the waters, became the sharpest thorn. She often visited the mansion under the guise of checking in on Clara, but her real intention was to poison Edward's perception. One evening, as Edward returned late from the boardroom, Margaret intercepted him in the study. "Edward," she began, her tone sugary yet laced with venom, "do you ever wonder if Clara is truly suited for this world? The parties, the diplomacy, the pressure? She looks more like a guest in your house than its lady." Edward bristled, defensive at first, but Margaret pressed further, implying Clara's growing involvement with charities was a way to avoid responsibilities as his wife. Though Edward dismissed her with a cold stare, her words festered in his mind. He loved Clara, but he began to wonder if their paths were diverging, if she still understood the weight on his shoulders, or if she was quietly building a world apart from his. Clara sensed these doubts without Edward ever voicing them. His demeanor toward her shifted in subtle ways, less patience, shorter answers, a distracted gaze even when she tried to connect. She noticed how he leaned more heavily on Victoria's guidance, how his laughter came easier in her company during corporate galas than at the quiet dinners Clara tried to arrange at home. The mansion, once simply cold, now felt haunted by the ghost of the man she had married. Clara tried to bridge the distance, often sharing stories from her charitable work, hoping to remind Edward of the values that once bound them. But instead of listening, he would nod absently, murmuring, "That's good, Clara," before retreating into files and phone calls. Her heart grew heavy as she realized she was no longer his confidant but an afterthought in his empire-driven life. In her darkest hours, she turned to her journal, pouring out fears she dared not speak aloud, that wealth had not elevated Edward, but was transforming him into someone she barely recognized, a man torn between the sincerity of his past and the seduction of power. The tension between them grew into an unspoken wall, each day brick by brick. Clara's encounters with Dr. Daniel Carter became a source of strength, though she was careful to keep their friendship innocent. Daniel encouraged her to see herself not merely as Edward's wife but as a woman with her own influence and purpose. His words gave her courage, but they also deepened her loneliness. She wondered why Edward could no longer see the same value in her. Meanwhile, Edward's doubts spiraled as whispers from the board suggested that Clara lacked the refinement expected of a Harrington matriarch. Even Charles Whitmore, though subtle, advised Edward to consider the optics of his marriage. For the first time since proposing beneath that oak tree, Edward allowed himself to question whether marrying Clara had been a decision of the heart that now stood at odds with the destiny thrust upon him. These shadows of doubt, invisible yet suffocating, cast their longest reach over their marriage. Neither knew it yet, but the cracks forming now would soon deepen into chasms, forcing both to confront truths they had long feared to face. The Harrington Empire was not merely a collection of businesses, it was a living beast with countless mouths to feed and voices clamoring for control. As Edward tried to balance its demands, the pressure mounted from every direction. The board of directors, many of them men who had known his late uncle, were not content with Edward's inexperience. They whispered doubts in backrooms, questioned his decisions in front of investors, and planted suggestions that cut like knives. One such suggestion returned again and again, that his marriage to Clara was weakening the family's image. A Harrington wife should command presence, prestige, and connections, one board member remarked during a tense meeting, his eyes narrowing as if Clara's absence at such gatherings was an intentional slight. Others, emboldened by Victoria Hale's influence, began to push the notion further, that a different wife, one with pedigree and ambition, could strengthen the Harrington name in the global stage. Edward outwardly rejected these implications, insisting Clara was his partner, but inside, he felt the weight of their expectations. Every time he left such meetings, he wondered if his loyalty to Clara was painting him as a weak leader in their eyes, a thought that left him torn between his heart and the empire that now consumed him. Clara, unaware of the full extent of these conversations, felt the consequences all the same. She noticed how Edward grew more distant after board meetings, his words clipped, his patience fraying. The evenings they once shared were now reduced to hurried dinners where his phone buzzed incessantly with messages from Victoria or Charles. She would try to share her joy about the children at her literacy program, but Edward's distracted nods made her voice feel like background noise. Worse still, Margaret's venomous presence added fuel to Clara's growing unease. Margaret had started attending more of the Harrington galas, always dressed to impress, always whispering in corners with Edward's colleagues. To Clara's dismay, Margaret no longer cloaked her disdain behind veiled remarks. Instead, she would make cutting observations aloud, such as "Clara seems much more comfortable with children in a classroom than among dignitaries." Though Clara smiled through the humiliation, her heart cracked a little more each time, especially when Edward failed to defend her with the fire she longed to see. For Clara, the mansion no longer felt like a home but a stage where she played a part in a script written by others, her role shrinking with every passing day. Victoria Hale's influence loomed larger with each step Edward took into his empire. Where Clara's presence at Edward's side seemed to invite criticism, Victoria's drew approval. She was clever, charming, and unafraid to dominate conversations in ways that made Edward look competent simply by association. The media, too, began to speculate. Headlines hinted at the closeness between Edward and his consultant, and photographs captured them laughing together at functions where Clara stood awkwardly to the side. Though Edward dismissed the rumors as sensationalism, Clara could not ignore the gnawing fear that their bond was no longer simply professional. In quiet moments, she confronted Edward gently, asking if he still saw her as the same woman he had promised to love under the oak tree. His replies were defensive, frustrated. "Clara, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. I need allies who know this world." She would retreat to her room, tears staining her pillow, realizing the gap between them was no longer just physical but emotional, widening into something she feared she could not bridge. The Empire was pulling Edward in one direction, and Clara in another, and for the first time, the possibility that love alone might not be enough began to weigh heavily on them both. The night Edward finally uttered the words that shattered Clara's heart began like so many others, with a gala. The ballroom of the Harrington Tower glittered with chandeliers and echoed with the hum of wealth. Crystal glasses chimed, violins played, and Edward moved through the crowd like a man born to it. Clara, dressed elegantly yet uncomfortably in a gown chosen by Margaret, stood at his side like an accessory. She felt the weight of stares, the polite smiles tinged with pity or superiority. When Edward was called away for another conversation with investors and Victoria Hale, Clara lingered near the edge of the room, watching him laugh too easily, his posture too relaxed with the woman who had woven herself into his life. Anna, who had insisted on accompanying Clara for support, tried to cheer her with gentle words, but Clara could not shake the sensation of being invisible. By the time the event ended and they returned to the mansion, her silence was heavy enough to fill the entire car ride. Edward, tired and irritated, broke the silence with a sigh that sounded more like defeat than frustration. Once inside the quiet of the mansion, Clara finally asked the question that had been festering in her chest for months. "Edward, do you even see me anymore?" Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady, demanding an answer. He turned to her, his face worn and drawn from endless pressure, and after a long pause he said the words that cut deeper than any betrayal could. "Clara, I think I need some space. I need time to rethink our marriage." The words hung in the air, sharp and final, as if he had rehearsed them. Clara's breath caught, her hands clutching the edge of the marble counter as though the world beneath her was tilting. She wanted to scream, to demand how he could so easily cast aside everything they had built together, but no words came. Instead, she nodded slowly, her dignity shielding her from collapse in front of him. Edward, perhaps expecting her to protest or beg, looked unsettled by her calmness. But Clara's silence was not acceptance, it was the raw beginning of heartbreak. The days that followed were a blur. Edward moved out of the mansion temporarily, taking up residence in the penthouse suite atop Harrington Tower. The tabloids feasted on the news, speculating about the couple's fracture and fanning rumors of Victoria's role in it all. Clara, left alone in the cavernous mansion, refused to let herself fall apart in public. Anna became her lifeline, visiting often, her warmth a shield against the loneliness. Daniel Carter also appeared during those days, not as a savior but as a steady presence, reminding Clara that her worth was not defined by Edward's neglect. Clara poured her sorrow into her journal, each page an outlet for grief and betrayal, but she also resolved not to lose herself. She had given Edward her heart, her loyalty, and her belief in love. If he chose to step away, she would not crumble. What Edward didn't yet realize was that in pushing Clara away to rethink their marriage, he had awakened something in her, a determination not to be merely the forgotten wife of an empire, but a woman who would rise from the ashes of his rejection stronger than he ever imagined. Clara's first mornings without Edward in the mansion were brutal. She woke to silence, no sound of his hurried footsteps dressing for meetings, no rushed kiss on the forehead before he disappeared into the chaos of his empire. Instead, she rose alone, her reflection in the gilded mirrors reminding her that though the house was hers, her heart was fractured. Yet grief, for Clara, did not turn into despair, it hardened into resolve. She had spent too long allowing others to define her, too long standing quietly in Edward's shadow, watching as ambition devoured the man she once knew. She began channeling her pain into action, revisiting the charities where she had already begun to leave her mark. With each visit, Clara found her voice growing stronger. She organized literacy workshops, fundraising dinners, and medical supply drives, her efforts quickly catching the attention of local media. Headlines that once criticized her as unfit for wealth now painted her as the forgotten wife who had built her own empire of compassion. For the first time in months, Clara felt alive, not because she had Edward's attention, but because she was reclaiming her own. It was during one of these charity events that Clara discovered something unexpected: a locked drawer in Sir William Harrington's old study, left untouched even after Edward had taken possession of the mansion. The drawer, secured with a brass key hidden in a false panel, revealed a bundle of handwritten letters tied neatly with ribbon. To her astonishment, they were addressed not to Edward, but to the heir who will inherit my mistakes. As Clara read, she realized these letters were warnings from William himself, penned in his final years as he watched the empire consume him. He wrote of the dangers of pride, of the vultures that would circle a Harrington heir, and of how wealth could twist love into power struggles. One letter in particular struck Clara. William admitted that he had once sacrificed love for empire, and it left him with riches but no peace. Clara wept as she read, recognizing in William's regrets the very path Edward was now treading. She tucked the letters away, knowing that one day Edward would need to see them, though she doubted he was ready to hear the truths just yet. Meanwhile, Clara's growing influence began to ripple outward. Donors admired her sincerity, volunteers flocked to her cause, and Daniel Carter stood by her side, offering both practical support and gentle encouragement. Though she kept their friendship carefully within bounds, Clara could not ignore how his presence steadied her. Where Edward had grown distant and distracted, Daniel listened, valued her words, and reminded her of the power she carried in her own right. Yet even as she found strength in new beginnings, Clara could not entirely silence the ache in her heart. At night, in the vast emptiness of the Harrington mansion, she would still glance at the door, half expecting Edward to return. But then she would remember the letters, the warnings of what unchecked ambition could do, and she would steel herself again. Clara's strength was no longer just about enduring, it was about rising. And though Edward had told her he needed space to rethink their marriage, Clara was now preparing, perhaps unknowingly, to prove that she no longer needed him to define her life at all. While Clara was quietly rebuilding herself, Edward found his new life in the Harrington Tower penthouse far less liberating than he had imagined. At first, he told himself he needed the space. That time away from Clara would help him clear his mind and focus on managing the empire. But instead of clarity, he found only suffocating chaos. The board of directors grew more divided with each passing week, their criticisms cutting sharper than he expected. Some praised his willingness to modernize, while others mocked his inexperience, calling him a boy dressed in his uncle's shoes. Every decision Edward made was scrutinized, debated, and often undermined. Victoria Hale remained at his side through it all, offering advice and reassurance, but Edward began to notice how her counsel always seemed to serve her own interests more than the company's. The tabloids, meanwhile, whispered of an emerging power couple, further complicating matters, even though Edward never saw Victoria as more than an advisor. The empire that had once seemed like a gift was revealing itself as a gilded chain, and Edward could feel himself sinking under its weight. His personal life was no less turbulent. Rumors of his separation from Clara spread like wildfire, and though Edward tried to ignore them, the sting of seeing his marriage dissected in public aided him. He missed her presence more than he dared admit, missed the grounding calm of her voice and the way she made their small apartment feel like a sanctuary. Alone in the penthouse, surrounded by luxury, he realized how empty wealth felt without her warmth to soften it. Still, his pride refused to let him reach out. Instead, he threw himself deeper into work, attending endless late-night meetings, signing contracts he barely had time to read, and drowning in obligations. Margaret, ever cunning, used the moment to slither closer, presenting herself as an ally in family matters. She praised his decisions in public, whispering in private that Clara had never been strong enough to bear the Harrington name. Edward tried to ignore her venom, but in moments of exhaustion, doubt crept in, and he wondered if perhaps she was right. Yet the most devastating blow came from within the empire itself. Rival companies began circling like predators, sensing his inexperience as weakness. Deals collapsed, shareholders threatened lawsuits, and whispers of a takeover began to swirl. Edward found himself trapped in a storm of ambition and betrayal, forced to admit he was losing control of the very empire he had inherited. For the first time since he became the Harrington heir, Edward questioned not just his leadership, but his very identity. Was he truly cut out for this world, or had he been nothing more than a mechanic's son thrust into a crown too heavy to bear? In sleepless nights, he replayed Clara's words in his mind, the ones she had spoken when they still lived above the bakery. Love is our foundation, Edward. Without it, nothing else will stand. He had thought distance would bring clarity, but now, drowning in the Empire's demands and surrounded by wolves in disguise, he realized the truth, that in pushing Clara away, he had not created space for thought, but for ruin. And as he stared out over the glittering skyline from his penthouse window, Edward felt, for the first time, the creeping fear that he was about to lose everything, his marriage, his empire, and himself. The breaking point for Edward came not in the boardroom, but on the front pages of every major newspaper. It began with whispers, rumors that Victoria Hale had been using her proximity to Edward to broker secret deals that funneled profits into shell companies tied to her own associates. At first, Edward dismissed the claims as petty slander from rivals, but the evidence mounted quickly: leaked documents, recorded conversations, and testimonies from disgruntled employees. When the scandal erupted fully, Edward's name was plastered across headlines, not as the celebrated heir but as the careless fool who had allowed corruption to thrive under his watch. Investors panicked, shareholders threatened mass withdrawals, and the Empire's stock plummeted overnight. The once confident Edward now stood accused of incompetence, his image tainted by association with Victoria's treachery. In public, he attempted to defend himself, insisting that he had been misled, but behind closed doors, doubt gnawed at him. He realized that in his hunger to be taken seriously, he had allowed himself to be manipulated, and now the Empire bore the scars of his blindness. While Edward's reputation unraveled, Clara's star began to rise. The very newspapers that crucified Edward celebrated Clara for her charitable work. Photographs of her surrounded by children, visiting hospitals, and leading fundraising campaigns painted her as the compassionate face the Harrington legacy desperately needed. "The wife he left behind is the one saving his name," one headline declared. Clara never sought the spotlight, but her sincerity spoke louder than any speech Edward had ever delivered. Donors who once turned away from the Harrington name now rallied behind Clara's initiatives, restoring some measure of dignity to the family brand. For Clara, the irony was sharp. The empire that had driven a wedge between her and Edward was now being salvaged not by boardroom maneuvers but by the power of compassion. She did not rejoice in Edward's downfall, but neither did she hide from the truth. His choices had consequences, and his failure to value what they once had was now laid bare for the world to see. Deep within, however, a quiet conflict raged. Her love for him had not died, but the pain of his rejection made her question whether she could ever forgive him. The scandal also reshaped the balance of power within the Harrington circle. Margaret, who had positioned herself as Edward's staunchest supporter, was exposed as having known about Victoria's dealings but choosing to remain silent, hoping Edward's fall would eventually open the way for her own influence. Charles Whitmore, the family lawyer, distanced himself from Edward, advising the board to consider stripping him of certain decision-making powers. Edward found himself increasingly isolated, abandoned by those who had once sung his praises. In his solitude, he was forced to confront truths he had long avoided, that Clara's strength, not his pride, had always been the true heart of their partnership, that his uncle's empire was never meant to be propped up by ambition alone but by love, loyalty, and integrity. Late at night, staring at the damning articles scattered across his desk, Edward recalled the letters William had written, the warnings about greed, betrayal, and the cost of power. He wondered if Clara had found them, if she understood what he was only now beginning to grasp. For the first time, Edward realized that saving the Harrington Empire was not about conquering markets or silencing rivals, it was about winning back the woman who embodied everything he had lost. And yet, he knew the path to her forgiveness would be the hardest battle he had ever faced. Edward's fall from grace had stripped him of illusions, leaving him raw and restless. Alone in the Harrington Tower penthouse, he began piecing together the mess Victoria and Margaret had left in their wake. In the process, he stumbled across correspondence hidden deep within his late uncle's files, letters and journals William Harrington had kept during his final years. They revealed painful truths. William had deliberately chosen Edward, the outsider nephew, to inherit the empire not because of pedigree, but because he believed Edward still had a chance to live differently from the rest of the family. William admitted his fortune had destroyed his own marriage, had turned love into a negotiation and children into rivals. "Do not let the empire make you forget who you are," one line read, its ink smudged as if William's hand had trembled when writing it. Reading those words, Edward felt as though his uncle were speaking directly into his shattered soul. He realized with brutal clarity that in chasing approval from strangers, he had neglected the one person who had always seen him for who he truly was, Clara. At the same time, whispers about Margaret's manipulations began to surface. An investigative journalist uncovered that she had fueled the board's doubts against Clara, leaking private comments and orchestrating scenarios to make Clara appear unfit. Worse still, Margaret had been quietly meeting with rivals, angling for a stake in the empire should Edward be declared unfit to lead. When Edward confronted her, her mask of cousinly concern dropped, and she spat the truth with venom. "You were never meant to carry this empire, Edward. You're weak, and Clara is weaker. I only did what was necessary." For the first time in months, Edward's anger burned, not at Clara, not at himself, but at the people who had preyed on his insecurities. He realized that Margaret, Victoria, and even the board had manipulated his fears, twisting his doubts about Clara into tools for their gain. That revelation broke something inside him, but it also sparked a painful resolve. He would reclaim not just the empire, but the love he had foolishly pushed away. Regret washed over him in waves. He remembered Clara's laughter in their small apartment, her kindness in packing him lunches when he worked overtime, the way she believed in his dreams even when he doubted himself. Now she stood before the world not as his shadow, but as a light that shone brighter than his empire. Her charities had restored faith in the Harrington name, her compassion had won hearts where his ambition had failed. Edward realized that the empire had survived not because of him, but because of her. That truth was both humbling and devastating. For days, he wrestled with the fear that it was too late, that Clara's heart had closed to him forever. Still, he knew what he had to do. He could not undo the hurt he had caused, but he could fight to show her the man she had fallen in love with under the oak tree, before wealth and pride clouded everything. And so, Edward resolved to begin again, not as the heir of Harrington, but as the man who had once vowed that love would always be enough. Whether Clara would believe him again was a question that left him both terrified and hopeful. Edward stood at the gates of the Harrington mansion, the place that had once symbolized triumph but had nearly cost him everything. He wasn't dressed in the tailored suits that had become his armor, but in a simple jacket, one Clara would remember from their earlier days. Inside, Clara was preparing for yet another charity event, her name now spoken with reverence in circles that once dismissed her. When she saw him, her heart clenched, torn between anger, longing, and the memory of the man she had once loved so fiercely. Edward's voice cracked as he said, "I don't come as Harrington, Clara. I come as Edward, the man who still believes in us." His words weren't rehearsed, and for the first time in months, Clara believed his sincerity. Clara listened in silence as Edward confessed his failures, the pride that blinded him, the doubts that poisoned his love, the distance he allowed others to build between them. He handed her a bundle of his uncle's letters, the ones William had written in regret, and admitted he now understood their meaning. Clara's hands trembled as she read the inked warnings, her mind replaying every moment she had tried to hold their marriage together. She wanted to forgive him instantly, but her dignity reminded her of the pain he had caused. "Love is not enough without respect, Edward," she whispered, her voice steady. Edward nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "Then let me earn both again." In that moment, Clara saw not the empire's heir, but the man who had once fixed a broken microphone in a crowded hall without seeking applause, the Edward she had first fallen for. The path to reconciliation would not be easy. Clara did not open her arms immediately, nor did Edward expect her to. Instead, she told him he must prove through actions, not promises, that he valued her above power. Edward accepted, knowing the road ahead would demand humility, patience, and a rebirth of trust. As Clara stepped into her car for the event, Edward offered his hand, not as a husband reclaiming his wife, but as a man hoping for a second chance. She hesitated, then took it, lightly, cautiously, but enough to spark hope. Outside, the world buzzed with cameras and headlines, but inside their hearts, something fragile but real began to mend. Their story was not over, it was only beginning again, this time not under the weight of an empire, but under the fragile strength of two people choosing each other anew. The end.